Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. I don't often make videos at sunset. It's quite pretty and everything and the camera seems to cope with the lighting, but often there's a bit of a wind that gets in the microphone and annoys both me and presumably you. But here we go, yeah, we're having the last of the good weather and there's some cloud coming over again, so I thought time to come out and have a chat with you. I had a sad sight yesterday. I was driving along the M1 motorway, which is the big motorway that leads past the macadamia growing district in the Northern Rivers. Now, kids often look out the window trying to find something interesting to look at, and they'll see banana plantations and stuff like that, but when you drive past Newry Bar, you'll see one or two macadamia farms. And I can just imagine a kid pointing out the window and going, "What's that, Dad?" at all these rows of trees, and Dad, if he knows his stuff, will say, "Well, those are macadamias, son." And funnily enough, I discovered macadamias a similar way. It was before the M1, when I got lost wandering around after a little court case in Murwillumbah. And if you want the full story on that, you can look at the video Lifestyle Macadamia Farming, which funnily enough is my most watched video. I'm still not sure why. Anyway, when I went down the road this day, I saw that the hill where these macadamias had been growing had looked like it had been scrubbed clean. The land was completely flat. There were sort of vague brown markings where rows of trees had been. And then if you looked at the end of the field, there were all the dead trees. Trees this big and bigger, just basically had been pulled up by their roots, stacked in a great big pile at the end of the paddock, and someone had come along and basically rubbed out the existence of the macadamia orchard. And I think from a marketing point of view, as well as just a farmer's point of view, it's not a nice thing to see. And it does actually have a PR consequence in that macadamia farms do alert people to the presence of the industry, the presence of the farming, and leads to some community support that way as well. Not everyone, unfortunately, turns off the M1 and comes up to places like Rosebank. Or maybe I should be grateful for that. Anyway, look, there were two ways to look at it. Either the guy who erased his field was giving up macadamia farming altogether, or he was pulling up all the old trees and planning to plant a new block of macadamias to replace the old. Now, it's an extreme measure, but it's not a bad idea in a low price environment, because it means that the income you miss out while the new trees are growing, the income you miss out on won't be as much. And when you do get the income from the new trees, you're hopefully growing a better variety, something more tailored to the needs of the market. We know that the nut processors want big, whole nuts. They want reasonably high kernel recovery, and they want a nice taste and everything else as well. But for the farmer, the perspective is, well, we want dollars per hectare. And if the pricing structure is tweaked to incentivize one attribute or another in nuts, we've just seen in 2023 a whole nut adjustment from the biggest supplier, Marquee, the biggest nut processor. And up in central Queensland, according to one of my subscribers, Trent, he says that farmers are being penalised for small nuts. And in a low price environment, you'll be penalised for not giving the processors what they want. In a high price environment, what tends to happen is you get rewarded for those attributes when you do give it to them. So a farmer with a blank slate, like the one I saw yesterday, might well be wondering, what do I plant in a low price environment? Like, if we assume the worst and say, look, macadamias are going from a luxury nut to a commodity nut, and that the prices may never recover to their former glory in 2020, you're going to look at efficiency. You want a large amount of kernel per hectare, but you also want to meet the requirements of the nut processors in terms of what sells. So you want the whole nuts, the big nuts, and lots of them. So when I thought about that, I sat down for a while with a cup of tea and thought, geez, let's go through the macadamia varieties that you can get and try and find the perfect one that will answer all of these problems. And I'll jump straight to the end of the story. There isn't such an animal, at least not in my knowledge. But there are some that come closer than others, and they're not necessarily what the industry's planting at the moment. So this one you see in front of me, the MCT1, is probably the most popular planting at the moment. It has the big round balls, it has a reasonable amount of whole kernel, but when you look at what it costs to produce, it's rumoured to be a very hungry tree, like one of its parents, the A4. And fertiliser prices, while they are coming down, they're still quite expensive. Also, one of the penalties of high kernel recovery is that you have to take extra steps to protect your crop from insects, from rats, and it just means that the nut can be penetrated more easily by those pests and either sort of taken entirely in the case of rats or spoiled in the case of insects. MCT1 is good on fungus resistance, from what we're told. It hasn't really been tested strongly in New South Wales, but it seems to be going okay. So not having to spray fungicides is a definite plus. So all up, MCT1 might be okay, but it is a bit heavy on the input side in a low price environment. Up in the next paddock I have macadamia variety R, which I've raved about way too many times, but basically it's better protected than the MCT1. It has smaller nuts as a result of that. It has a higher percentage of whole kernel, which is going to come in handy. And it isn't as hungry by reputation as the MCT1. Now there's a couple of other new varieties floating around, and the early signs back for macadamia variety P are good, even though it's only really rated for Bundaberg. I've seen examples of it in New South Wales where the crop on early trees has been quite heavy, and it could be a good little tree. It's a dwarfing tree, doesn't seem to be particularly hungry, but you know, having A16 as one of its parents, my guess is it probably is a bit on the hungry side. I just think a tree that is naturally small, like this little pea is, a tree that's naturally small is probably likely to be less resource hungry for you over the years, and it's reasonably disease resistant too, so not too bad. And the kernel recovery is a little low because the shell and the husk are reasonably thick. But, you know, in these low price climates, when you've got your pricing table, you used to get huge increments for every extra percent of kernel recovery. You don't get that anymore because the price is so low. So maximum kernel recovery might slip a little bit in the priority rankings. So what about the older A varieties? So A4 and A16. I would write them off as a farming option for the leaner times. They have big kernels, they can have high kernel recovery, and in the case of A16 they can crop fairly heavily. The problem is they are so heavy on inputs, and in the case of A16 very susceptible to husk spot and requires quite a lot of spraying. A4 is actually husk spot resistant, that's one of its great attributes, but it needs a lot of protection from rats and insects because it has a very thin shell and a very thin husk, easy for those nasties to get through and take your nut away from you. What about the older Hawaiians? Well, 344 is sort of husk spot resistant. It has a lot of disadvantages in my opinion, but if you do keep it under control and stop it from becoming a huge tree, and you can keep the sunlight up to it and the feed up to it, it can provide very heavy crops, and they're reasonably impervious to a lot of things because they've got a thick shell, a medium sort of husk, and they're about 30%, 33% max kernel recovery. But what you lose in the kernel recovery you can make up for in volume. If you let the trees get too big, as Nutkin Farm did, you get none of those advantages, and the crop can be very miserable in terms of volume, and so you actually get all of the disadvantages, none of the advantages. But people are still planting 344. I kind of understand why, but they need to have their eyes open and they need to be vigilant about pruning down the track, and that is an expense. China went the other way. Funnily enough, China adopted the older 333, which came out obviously before the 344. It was one of the original varieties grown with the 246. I write off 246 because it's very husk spot prone, although it can be a very big cropper and it isn't overly fussy. So, not bad, not good. But 333 is an interesting one, and Trevor Hicks, among others, are fans of it in the Northern Rivers, saying, look, yes, the kernel recovery is low, usually below 30% kernel. That's how thick the shell is. But it is a low maintenance nut. The tree doesn't require a hell of a lot of nutrition. It laughs off husk spot and other diseases in general. I'm not absolutely sure about the husk spot point. That's just what I heard from one farmer. And the volume of crop is massive. It's a very, very heavy cropper. So I thought, okay. And look, it's one of the main ones being grown in China now, and China's rapidly becoming self-sufficient for their macadamias on that particular variety. I don't know where else it's grown in the world. It's possible it's grown in South Africa. Maybe if I have a South African subscriber who can chip in and tell me. It sounds like it's not a bad strategy. I always thought it was a good strategy for an organic macadamia farmer, simply because it's so bulletproof that if you can't use sprays, this is the tree for you. So, and there's some others that are, weren't really well tried and tested, which, I'm going to try the 783, which is husk spot tolerant and is a very heavy cropper, but I don't know really what it's like in terms of kernel recovery and that sort of thing. Perhaps it's good. It certainly seems to have a reasonably medium husk and medium shell. So, you would expect, like the 246 it's descended from, to be a reasonable performer. Just hasn't been widely tried. 781, same sort of thing, although it is quite fungus susceptible, so I've written off the 781 for the purpose of this exercise. Then we have two interesting A varieties in the middle. So, just a potted history. Hidden Valley Plantations brought out the A4 and A16, and they were one of the first ever plants, those two, were the first ever plants to get plant variety rights protection back in 1987. I think they got a bit disillusioned with how that worked out for them, because when they came out with the A38 and the A203, they let the A38 PVR lapse, and the A203, they didn't do plant variety rights at all. They just did contracts with growers, non-propagation contracts. The problem with just doing contracts is it only binds the two people who sign it, and you can't really sort of extend that protection down the line. So, you could plant A203s in your farm and you might be bound not to propagate them, but the next owner won't be. And so the cat got out of the bag now, and nearly everyone can sell you an A203 royalty free. The only people who can't are the farms loyal to Hidden Valley Plantations. And that's interesting because they're the only ones allowed to sell the brand new A varieties, the A538, 447, 376. If they're not passing on royalties for A203s, they're not allowed to sell these new ones, and that's probably why these new ones aren't selling terribly well. I am getting some of these new A varieties to trial, and that'll be the subject of an upcoming video. But the contract I just had to sign for royalties, which need to be paid in advance, went to 38 pages. And this is plant breeders' rights protected, so fine, I'm not going to breed any plants from these trees, but gosh, what a lot of paperwork. And the royalties, I think, are $5 a tree, which I'll pay. Poor David Bell needs to be paid for his work. However, with the A203, he wasn't paid, and he got disillusioned again. And while he didn't rate the A203 very highly, once it got adopted by the industry, people started realising this is one of the best macadamias out there. It did tend to have a thick shell and a thick husk, and so its kernel recovery could be a little low. But its cropping was notorious. It has enormous flowering. It turns a lot of that into nut. And within about 3 years of planting is churning out almost commercial crops of macadamias. And partly at least, the A203 is husk spot tolerant. And so on all the things that I've mentioned in this video in terms of the desirable traits, really apart from the desire for very big nuts, and apart from the desire for high whole kernels, because A203 they're sort of marginal on that. They're not poor, but they're not good. Apart from those things, the A203 is really quite a decent variety to grow. So is the A38. Now, the A38 has its problems with husk spot, big problems with husk spot, but it is a huge cropper and almost makes up for those problems by the amount of crop it has. The nuts can be fairly big. There's a high percentage of whole kernel, and the tree itself is measured to be the lowest input tree of any macadamia, as in it does more with less food than just about any other variety. So long as you don't mind spraying for fungus, and the new breeding programs are trying to breed that out of macadamias, so bear that in mind. But so long as you're prepared to spray for fungus, A38 might be on your short list. So I think would A203. And I think if you had those two varieties planting from the blank slate, which I saw before, you might actually do all right with those. There's many other varieties I could discuss, but it's going to get way too boring. I just wanted to basically give you my views on what you might want to plant in the efficiency stakes, so that when the macadamia price comes back up, while many people will be able to take advantage of that, your advantage will be greater because you're growing a more efficient crop. That's my video, guys. I will see you again soon, and I best do my last bit of work. I'm going to sow some clover before the sun goes down. Oh, and just as a postscript, a bit of a sad one, I was driving along the Hinterland Way and came past the site that I described to you earlier. It's a little bit confronting, I have to say, but there it is. Hopefully we won't be seeing too much more of that. Catch you later.